she's in a good. Everything that has happened in this trial. I just spoke with her and with the U.S. Attorney's Office team, and she's in a good place. She's pleased that again that the jury has found him liable, guilty of 2 federal crimes.
What was her reaction?
And I've issued a statement as well on our Twitter as well. Her reaction is what I just said. Her reaction was that she was pleased that he's been found guilty and held responsible of 2 federal crimes, something that he's never been held responsible in his entire life. And she's happy that in November of 2023 she came forward and shined a light on this and brought other people forward who have various civil claims, and so we'll see what happens with the sentencing. All right,
Counsel,
thank you very much.
Looking at this direction, you said that same thing. Sorry.
Oh, I can't repeat it again, but
yeah, please.
Sorry. So, what was the question?
Yeah. Your reaction to what happened? Sorry.
The reaction is that we're pleased that he's finally been held responsible for 2 federal crimes, something that he's never faced in his life. He still faces substantial jail time. Of course, we would have liked to have seen a conviction on the sex crimes in RICO, but we understand beyond a reasonable doubt is a high standard, and we're just pleased that he still faces substantial jail time. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. How much time?
Doug Wigdor, W-I-G-D-O-R. Well, each is faces up to 10 years on each. I'm not sure what the sentencing guidelines are given the various different things, but I'll leave that up to the government and the defense to argue. But I feel confident in saying he still faces substantial incarceration.
How will you feel if he walks out on bail?
Well, that's up to the judge. I don't have a personal vested interest in this case. Whatever the appropriate thing to do under the law is what should be done. And at the end of the day, he needs to be sentenced pursuant to the guidelines and pursuant to what the law is. My understanding of that is that he faces significant incarceration. So thank you very much.
Thank you. He's the attorney for Kathy Ventura.
How you feeling?
Not bad. How are you?
Anything you want the public to know?
Not yet. We'll be saying something soon. Thanks.
Okay.
Watch your step.
Can you share your reaction?
Westmoreland is easier down.
And the judge indicated to him that he did not want to go back to MDC, the federal lockup in Brooklyn where he's been held. And that's when he clasped his hands together as if to say, that's exactly right, Judge. And so the judge said he would decide today whether to release him on bail. Prosecutors asked for a few hours to put their letter in opposing it. He does still, as prosecutors point out, face the possibility of 20 years in prison on the conviction of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. And the way prosecutors see it, he's a flight risk and a potential danger. Even though they did not prove the sex trafficking or the racketeering conspiracy, prosecutors still told the judge he has a predilection to committing crimes, including violent crimes, and represents a potential danger, particularly to women. He also, we should say, Diane, faces at least 6 civil lawsuits that accuse him of acts of violence. We'll see where those shake out in the coming weeks and months, but Combs would no doubt like to try and fend those off as quickly as possible. Outside here, Diane, there is a crowd of supporters that looks like they're going to hang out to see whether he walks through those golden doors sometime this afternoon.
And I want to drill down on those civil suits with our legal contributor, Brian Buckmeyer, also here with me on set. Brian, I think it's in the realm of 60 civil lawsuits against Sean Combs right now. How does this verdict impact those cases?
Yeah, so about 60 or 59 civil lawsuits. I believe 14 of them involve a minor. And so the impact for those cases on this is somewhat positive in some lights, actually, ironically enough, and somewhat negative. The negative, obviously, in that he was found not guilty of the RICO conspiracy and the sex trafficking. So if there's any allegations that mirror that in these civil complaints, Sean Combs is going to feel very confident that he might be able to win those. But different allegations, different alleged victims. And I think, as Bernardo pointed out as well, there's a different standard there. And it comes to a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, a much higher standard than the civil standard of preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, or 51%. But the reason why I say it could be potentially positive for those filing civil lawsuits is if Sean Combs was found guilty of that racketeering conspiracy, there would be a forfeiture application in terms of trying to dismantle that racketeering conspiracy or that criminal enterprise, where the federal government would have had their opportunity to take money out of Sean Combs before the civil lawsuits would have had their opportunity. So in a way, Sean Combs may still have enough money in his pocket that those filing civil lawsuits might be able to find a victory through that process. I compare and contrast to, for example, the R. Kelly trial, where he was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy, and there was a forfeiture there, and many of the people filing civil lawsuits against R. Kelly found it difficult to win in those cases.
And I want to bring in Kelly Carter to talk about the cultural impact here, because, Kelly, it's hard to understate or overstate, I should say, the role of Sean Combs in music and culture in general. I mean, not only was he a legend in rap music, he was a legend in music in general, as a producer, as an artist, and then on to becoming a businessman with an empire. What does this mean for all that now?
I mean, I think it means a lot. The truth of the matter is that it almost didn't really matter what the outcome was of this trial. The conversation changes immediately about what his legacy is. You know, this is a person who really touched every corner of pretty much every industry, not just music, not just spirits, not just fashion, politics, pretty much every industry he touched. He really ushered the hip-hop generation into the mainstream, into commercialism, and made it the billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry that it is right now. And I think, you know, regardless of the outcome, it's going to be difficult for people to unhear some of that testimony and to certainly unsee, you know, that infamous now Intercontinental video that was released with him and Cassie from 2016. And I think that it'll be interesting to see what his life is like as a businessman moving forward, but I don't expect to see something in the immediacy. And I definitely expect us to be dissecting his legacy for a good while now.
And we do have a statement from Cassie Ventura's attorney, Douglas Wigdor. And he says, and I'm quoting here, "This entire criminal process started when our client, Cassie Ventura, had the courage to file her civil complaint in November of 2023. And I'm quoting here, "This entire criminal process started when our client, Cassie Ventura, had the courage to file her civil complaint in November of 2023. Although the jury did not find Combs guilty of sex trafficking Cassie beyond a reasonable doubt, she paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution." By Although the jury did not find Combs guilty of sex trafficking Cassie beyond a reasonable doubt, she paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. By coming forward with her experience, Cassie has left an indelible mark on both the entertainment industry and the fight for justice. We must repeat, paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. By coming forward with her experience, Cassie has left an indelible mark on both the entertainment industry and the fight for justice. We must repeat with no reservation that we believe and support our client, who showed exemplary courage throughout this trial. The statement goes on to talk about her strength on the stand and to talk about the misconduct they say has persisted for decades without repercussion. Bernarda, I want to go to you on this point of what this means for future cases, precedent here. Does a verdict like this deter future potential witnesses in similar cases?
I think it definitely does. A verdict like this does deter victims and witnesses from coming forward. I think when you're talking about when the perpetrator is one of who has power, who has money, who had the key to the city, I think victims are looking at it, wait, if the prosecution gave it all they had and they went after him and they still didn't find him guilty, what about little old me? What about just regular perpetrator from down the block? What's going to happen in that type of case? So I think this is a huge deterrence for victims.
And Brian, I'm out of time, but I quickly want to touch on the way this case was brought has been criticized from the beginning. The actual charges they brought, the fact that it was a federal trial and so on. Walk me through that part of it. And do you think there are any legal lessons learned there?
I think there are legal lessons in terms of how to bring this case. I think for federal prosecutors, they've used the RICO statute in very creative ways. If you want to talk about R. Kelly, if you want to talk about Donald Trump, there have been people who have been in the spotlight who have bemoaned and said that this is not how the statute was meant to be. And I think this might be one of the first major setbacks in this use of the statute in this kind of new wave. And I think this is going to be, agreeing with what Bernarda said, but I'll add on to a reevaluation of how do we define RICO going forward? Who fits into a RICO? What is a criminal enterprise? And are we going to open or close off how we now progress or move forward in terms of evaluating should we use this statute for these different types of enterprises?
All right. Rena, Brian, Bernarda, Kelly, thank you all. And big thanks to Aaron Katursky, who again has been at that court.
After 6 weeks of more than 9 months after his more than 9 months after his arrest and after 6 weeks of trial, we could finally know the fate of Sean Diddy Combs by the end of today. In just a few hours, deliberations will continue. Jurors in his federal trial say they have verdicts on 4 of the 5 counts, but the judge wants them to keep on working. News Nation's Alicia Nieves is outside the courthouse in New York City. Alicia, good morning. Does the jury think another day of discussions will break the deadlock issue?
Yeah, that's like the million-dollar question here. It's the answer that everybody wants. The reality is, unless you're one of those 12 jurors, there's no way to answer that. You know, right now, we do know, right at 9 o'clock, in just a few hours from now, those 8 men, 4 women who will decide the fate of Sean Diddy Combs, they are going to kind of pick up where they left off yesterday, and they're going to try and at least break the deadlock in what is the most serious and certainly most complicated charge of this trial. That is a racketeering and conspiracy charge. We know yesterday, of course, they deliberated for about 12 hours, and as you pointed out a moment ago, they arrived on a verdict for the charges here. 2 counts of sex trafficking and 2 counts of transportation of prostitution, but couldn't agree on RICO, the racketeering charge. A jury notes
with some of them that there are going to be multiple meetings between senior White House staff members with these Republicans. And an official tells me that the president has been heavily engaged in this from the beginning and that there's been constant communication between the administration and House Republicans.
Consented at the beginning, you can't revoke it. And we saw there was a sex worker in there. I mean, she didn't consent to every freak off, but I guess a jury felt if you consented at the beginning, you can't revoke it. And that's an old way of thinking. That's definitely not a way of thinking during the Me Too movement, but we're now living in a post-Me Too environment.
Interesting stuff. Dave Arenberger, good to get your thoughts today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's cross now to Joseph Cosgrove, who's a retired judge of Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court. He joins us now. Very good to talk to you, Joseph. So talk us through sentencing now, really. What is the judge in this case now going to be weighing up? He's asked the defence and prosecution to go away and come back in a couple of hours to share their thoughts. But what will his thoughts be, and what will he be considering?
Well, the first thing the judge must consider is now whether Mr. Combs should be released on bail. He's been detained for the past 10 months and lodged in a federal facility. So he will get credit for that time that he has served. Whatever sentence may be imposed, he already has 10 months in. But the judge, as every judge I've ever known, including myself when I was a trial judge, every judge will tell you that sentencing is the most difficult part of a judge's job. You're taking a person, you're assessing their life, you're assessing what their crime was, you're assessing the evidence that was presented against them. You obviously accept the jury's verdict. But in federal court, judges have the opportunity to consider also what's called relevant conduct. That means although Mr. Combs was acquitted of the charge of RICO and the charge of sex trafficking, the judge can nonetheless consider the evidence that was presented by the prosecution in those two instances and can use that against Mr. Combs when he decides what sentence to impose. The first thing he will do is consider what the probation office, the U.S. probation office, will prepare something called a pre-sentence report. And that pre-sentence report will divide up what are called the sentencing guidelines that are created by the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And that is an assessment of time. The offense itself, in this case, the two charges of transportation for prostitution purposes, they have a certain number of months incarceration. Then the judge will consider under the guidelines aggravating factors, maybe mitigating factors. Mr. Combs has never been prosecuted before. Again, the relevant conduct will come into play, and there will be a number set. And then the judge has to use that number as sort of a starting point. He can go up from that. He can go down from that. If he does, if he deviates from that number, he has to have a basis for it, a reasonable basis. Use that number as sort of a starting point. He can go up from that. He can go down from that. If he does, if he deviates from that number, he has to have a basis for it, a reasonable basis. Otherwise, there's a chance of overturning that on appeal. So it's a complicated process from here on. In fact, that's where most federal criminal litigation takes place, is on the issue of sentencing, since most cases end in plea agreements. Not in this case, obviously, but it is now a much more complicated process than the ordinary sentence, perhaps in a state court that doesn't have these kinds of intricate mechanisms.
The judge we're hearing reported apparently asked Sean Combs if he wanted to return to prison. What do you make of that? Why would the judge ask a question like that?
Well, yeah, it sounds unusual, doesn't it? But I think probably the basis for that was that as I said, Mr. Combs will gain credit for time served. So if he is in a situation that is not, I mean, no one wants to be incarcerated, no one wants to be detained, but if he is in a stable situation, knowing that sentencing will probably take place, I would say probably within the next 45 days, could be longer, but I would think that it would be a month and a half or 2 months, rather than, and knowing that he's probably going to be sentenced to some time that would be more than the 10 months. Does he want to continue to accumulate credit? That would be the one basis that I can see for the judge asking that kind of question.
And just to be clear, what would you say would be the minimum sentence we could maybe expect to hear, and what would you think realistically would be a maximum?
You know, as a judge in the trial system, I often did not know and should not have known what sentence I would impose until I went through not only the assessment of the pre-sentence report and the sentencing guideline evaluation, but also the presentation the actual sentencing itself of witnesses, of the defendant himself, from the lawyers. And at that point, that's when I made my decision. I may have had a hunch as to where I thought the sentence should be, but it wasn't until that moment that I made the decision. So it's hard to speculate what this judge will do. I can see a sentence here, probably between 5 and 10 years. That would be, I think, on the low end. The judge, he sat through this trial. He listened to all the evidence. Some of it was grotesque and graphic. which may mean that Mr. Combs is a bad person, but it may not mean, as the jury found, that he's not a racketeer, he's not a sex trafficker. But the judge may have a different view on that. It may say, well, there's enough evidence for me to consider that this is a person that is of such a character that he should not be given any sort of, as we'll call it, break. And the judge can impose a sentence above 10 years up to 20. He can combine the two sentences of possibly 10 years. I don't think that'll happen because, again, he would have to justify that and justify that in a sense contrary to the jury's verdict. But he has the power to do that. Federal judges in sentencing are very powerful.
And we heard from a former state attorney from Palm Beach, Florida, saying it's hard for jurors to avoid the fact that the person that they're hearing all this evidence is about is a celebrity. And as much as the court will try to reassure them that they must put that from their minds, it will be there in their minds. Is it equally hard for judges?
Well, we would hope that we take every person for who they are and what they are. His celebrity may be part of his character, but it should not one way or the other way if in favor or against him. That's going to be one of the aspects of the court's consideration. What kind of person is this? He's had a successful career in the music and entertainment industry. He has been very well celebrated. That's what celebrities are. He has many followers. But he also has this body of evidence that was presented in court that over the past month and a half that has just been horrible. The video of the terrible encounter with Cassie, it's just a horrible assessment. The judge can't ignore that, and celebrity does not trump that.
The fact that he has had his family and his children in court with him throughout this trial, is that something that the judge considers? Does that sway you in any way, that he has this sort of family backup?
Well, that's an important factor as to who this person is, that he has a supportive community around him. That would be the same with any defendant. The fact that they have a family, that they have children that rely on and that trust, and that, the judge will probably hear from them at the sentencing. He will probably hear them directly, either testifying or through submissions of letters. I would imagine in a case like this, there will be thousands of letters sent to the judge that the judge will take into account and consider. And those letters will probably be balanced for and against. But there will be a great deal of support. And family support is a major factor that a judge considers when imposing sentence. So the fact that they've been there through trial, that's important. But there will also be victim impact that will equally play in the judge's consideration. These people have been harmed, and now they are victims of crimes. The jury has determined that crimes have been committed, and these two women have been the victims of those crimes. So the judge will take that into serious consideration as well.
And in terms of those victim impacts, here in the UK, we have something called victim impact statements, where victims are given an opportunity to write down how this case has affected them, how it's changed their lives, and the judge considers that. Is that the same in the States? I mean, this is how, obviously, the sentencing appears to be coming straight after the verdict. We're often, here in the UK, there's a delay before that point.
Well, I'm assuming there's going to be a delay here as well. That again, I don't believe sentencing. I don't know what the judge had indicated earlier. I had not seen, but the sentencing, unless there is some agreement, which I cannot imagine that the prosecution and defense have agreed on a particular term. So I would imagine sentencing is going to be certainly delayed, and as I said, through that process of pre-sentence reports. And yes, we use the same language, victim impact statements. We did that in state courts. Federal courts have essentially the same thing. So there will be some response from the victims. Now, they will be interviewed certainly by the probation officers, and those probation officers in preparing their pre-sentence report will include the statements of the victims, the position of the victims, but they may have a more formal position as well, whether that's testifying or whether they submit something in writing to the court. But that will have a major impact, I'm sure, on what the judge decides.
And these victim impact statements, are they made public?
Well, Again, federal judges have a great deal of power. I doubt that they will be in this case. But the victim themselves, they will have the opportunity to make them public or to speak about them in public if they wish. I'm sure that these are counseled people. One of them was presented with the anonymous name of Jane, but she may, through her counsel, may present whatever she wants. They may ask the court not to reveal that. Judges have a great deal of power in that. Personally, I would be disinclined to reveal a victim impact statement other than to the defendant. The defendant has a right to know what the judge is considering.
Interesting stuff. Retired Judge Joseph Cosgrove, really good to get your expertise today. Thank you so much for talking us through all of that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Clip from him standing on the court steps a few moments ago, Douglas Wigdall. He is one of the prosecution lawyers, and he was the lawyer that represented Ms. Ventura. That's Cassie Ventura, and she is the unfortunate lady that the video of being dragged along a hospital corridor by her hair. She has issued the following statement in response to the verdict. It says the entire criminal process started when our client, Cassie Ventura, had the courage to file her civil complaint in November 2023. Although the jury did not find Combs guilty of sex trafficking, Cassie, beyond a reasonable doubt, she paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. By coming forward with her experience, Cassie has left an indelible mark on both the entertainment industry and the fight for justice. We are guilty of transportation in November 2023. Although the jury did not find Combs guilty of sex trafficking, Cassie, beyond a reasonable doubt, she paved the way for a jury to find him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. By coming forward with her experience, Cassie has left an indelible mark on both the entertainment industry and the fight for justice. We must repeat with no reservation that we believe and support our client, who showed exemplary courage throughout this trial. She displayed unquestionable strength and brought attention to the realities of powerful men in our orbit and the misconduct that has persisted for decades. Our client, who showed exemplary courage throughout this trial. She displayed unquestionable strength and brought attention to the realities of powerful men in our orbit and the misconduct that has persisted for decades without repercussion. This case proved that change is long overdue, and we will continue to fight on behalf of survivors. So that there, the prosecution lawyer representing Cassie Ventura, saying that despite the not guilty verdicts for 3 of these charges, that they repeat that they believe and support their client, who showed courage throughout. And interesting that they're saying this draws attention to the realities of powerful men in our orbit and the misconduct that has persisted for decades without repercussion, and that this case proves that change is long overdue. And they are saying that they will continue to fight on behalf of survivors.
Check, 1, 2, check, 1, 2, check, 1, 2, check. Oh, shit. Anyone want a mic check? Check, 1, 2, check.
Well, Joseph Cosgroves is still with us, the retired judge of Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court. And Joseph, just hearing that statement from prosecutor Douglas Wigdall, his final thought: this case proved that change is long overdue. We will continue to fight on behalf of survivors. Do you think this case will lead to any kind of change? Do you think women may, and not just women, men as well, may feel more able to come forward if they feel that they have been treated badly by somebody who perhaps is in a position of power or in a position of fame?
Well, when you have someone of this enormous presence in the entertainment industry, who has been in a rather somber situation over the last 10 months and is likely going to spend years in jail, I don't know how many years, that should send a message to anyone that no one is above the law, that victims have rights, that victims of sexual misconduct and sexual harm have rights as well, which sometimes that may not have been the case in our criminal justice system. They may have not been considered, may not have been given opportunity to present their side. one of the issues in this case was, well, some of the sexual conduct was consensual. And so does that absolve the non-consensual activity? Well, of course not. And the jury was clear on that. And the jury did its job. The sex trafficking and the RICO charges are very, very complicated and complex. But the jury did its job and made the determination that no, indeed, consent does, in one instance, does not absolve the horrible criminal conduct in the other instances. And the jury spoke as members of the community, and I think that's a message that will certainly be heard and should be heard.
Joseph Cosgrove, retired judge of Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court. Thank you very much again.
My pleasure.
Well, let's now bring in Lisa Bonham, who's an entertainment attorney and a former litigator as well. Lisa, good to talk to you today. What do you make of this verdict?
Thank you for having me. I, like a lot of other lawyers, am shocked. There are one school of us who really are more astonished with the verdict. And there is another school of thought, just like the jurors, who are pleased with the verdict. So I have more astonished with the verdict. And there is another school. Thank you for having me. I, like a lot of other lawyers, am shocked. There are one school of us who really are more astonished with the verdict. And there is another school of thought, just like the jurors, who are pleased with the verdict. So I have been consistent in stating that the elements of RICO seemed to be present and they seem to have been met. You have the issue of the criminal enterprise in terms of looking at people who helped allegedly or accused of helping Sean move in a certain way in terms of helping him further this issue of sex trafficking. And so when you have a RICO charge, you do have to look for the criminal enterprise, which we just talked about. And then you have to go down and look for predicate crimes. You only need 2 of the predicate crimes, of which there are 35. And I believe that Sean was accused of 8 of them. And in my opinion, I was seeing those being met, quite honestly. But what I have also been consistent in saying is that what matters is what the jury says. And none of the lawyers who were not in the court, none of the persons who were not in the court, none of us were privy to all of the information that the jurors saw. They were privy to a lot of information in terms of the freak-offs. They saw approximately, over an hour's worth of tape that we never saw. So we don't know what was on those tapes. Those jurors were the only ones that were in that. They saw approximately, over an hour's worth of tape that we never saw. So we don't know what was on those tapes. Those jurors were the only ones that were in that courthouse for 7 weeks straight. And they are the ones who delivered the verdict. And they are the ones who are standing by it. And we have to respect the verdict, whether or not we agree with it or not. But I do agree with what Cassie's lawyer said in terms of looking for justice, if you will, for people who have been trafficked or people who have been caught up in this cycle of sex trafficking or being in an abusive relationship and not being able to flee. That is a setback for those people. And remember, what we were looking for was force, fraud, or coercion. And implicit and explicit in every sexual relationship is consent. And it was clear, in my opinion, again, I'm not a juror, but it was clear in my opinion when they said they only needed 1. If you look at Sean dragging Cassie back, that seemed to be met. But you also have to juxtapose that with the personal relationship that they had. And that is where it seems to be that the jurors had the hardest time separating. Aside from the fact that RICO is notoriously difficult to understand, and there were 50 pages or so of RICO instructions, you do have that underlying incident that these were people who were in relationships with him for long periods of time. So clearly, the jurors did believe that this was a consensual relationship and believed the defense's argument that this was just between those two. When you did have other instances where you did show the commercial use of his human and commercial resources to further this behavior of the alleged sex trafficking, but the jurors obviously did not buy that.
This case has lifted the lid slightly, hasn't it? And I mean, I suppose it's a lid that was already lifted. I'm thinking back to the Michael Jackson trial that I covered some almost 20 years ago. The side effect of fame that we've seen here makes behaviour which is extreme and many people would say unacceptable entirely possible.
Correct. And if you look at the R. Kelly case, which was tried just across the river in the Eastern District of New York, you have R. Kelly, who was convicted of RICO and sex trafficking. Some of his victims were younger and underage, but two of his victims were people who were in relationships with R. Kelly. So this is not an unusual type of verdict to reach, but it is a very difficult verdict for non-lawyers and laypersons to understand. So it does lift the lid. It does make this type of behavior acceptable. That is why I had such a hard time seeing it. In terms of understanding consent, understanding force, fraud, and coercion, I don't see that even though the fact that this was a relationship, that does not negate the fact that certain times that you only needed one time, that maybe this did not rise to that. And remember, as I talked about, it is explicit and implicit in every sexual relationship and in every sexual encounter that consent is necessary. And so it is well known and established fact that husbands can be convicted of raping their wives. So it is no different. But apparently the jurors had a difficult time separating the personal and professional relationship of Combs. And they really said, this is his personal business. This did not rise to anything that had to do with his underlying enterprise, his business, even though there were texts that supported that D-Rock, his security guard, and Christina Karam were allegedly in furthering that. They did have instances that was shown where they did further certain conduct that could have been seen as aiding and abetting and setting up and facilitating the underlying element of sex trafficking in the RICO charge. And then you do have the other issue. I'm sorry, I just wanted to get to this point about the predicate crimes. Once you have force, fraud, or coercion, you also have to look at a pattern that is established and really go down the rabbit hole. There are 35 predicate crimes under RICO, and there were 8 charged in this instance. And you only need 2 of them: arson, kidnapping, forced labor, obstruction of justice, witness tampering. There are a lot of those that seem to me, as a lawyer who understands it, that especially when things were used, credit cards were used, human resources from Combs Enterprise were used, that did seem to meet the RICO charge. But again, what matters is what the jury said, and the jury has spoken. There is a double jeopardy that is attached. He cannot be retried. This conviction cannot be appealed. And so the verdict stands as is, and that is something that we all have to accept and respect, whether we agree with it or not.
And you said, that the jury were struggling a little bit with some elements. I mean, the jury did come back pretty quickly, didn't they? Were you surprised by how fast they delivered these verdicts?
I was surprised that they delivered it as quickly as they did with the result that we have seen. I will be clear in the fact, as I said before, I stand by what I saw and what a lot of us other lawyers really did seem to be into the elements, meeting the elements of RICO, of the separate personal accounts of sex trafficking of Cassie and Jane. So I was actually very, very surprised. I will say that and stand in that truth. I was very surprised that they came back as quickly as they did, rendering the verdict that they did, because it seems so obvious to a lot of us in the legal profession who do understand the elements of RICO that these seem to be met in the predicate crimes. But again, it is a very difficult charge to understand. And so when you're asking lay people to opine and use the reasonable person standard, it is very, very difficult for people to understand. And when you're looking at a case that carries 15 years to life, the jury wants to be sure in their opinion that they are being fair and impartial and delivering what they believe is justice. And they have delivered what they believe is justice. They are being fair and impartial and delivering what they believe is justice. And they have delivered what they believe is justice. To life, the jury wants to be sure in their opinion that they are being fair and impartial and delivering what they believe is justice. And they have delivered what they believe is justice.